much. It is a pleasure to be here. As Sandra indicated, she is a long-term colleague and friend. We worked together since the 1980s, and I always learn from her, always benefit from the association. I've been here another occasion, and it's a pleasure to be back in Scranton and to be with you today. I think the issue we're talking about, higher education's indispensable role in advancing and preserving democracy, couldn't be more central to us at this time. And I'm very pleased that the forum has taken this issue on and given me the opportunity to speak with you about this. You know, we now look at the United States and we can see very clearly that in this country, the crises we face. Those crises related to things such as COVID-19, graphically revealing the extent of inequalities in this country. We also saw, certainly with the killing of George Floyd and subsequent killing of Black Americans, the extreme, not only inequalities, but the issues of racial injustice as being so terribly central. We also see, of course, in the United States, situation in which we had an insurrection, a presidential-led insurrection, followed by an ongoing attempt by a major political party led by its former presidential candidate to subvert American democracy. That indeed is a crisis. That is a severe crisis in this country. If you saw David Leonhardt's piece in the New York Times yesterday, it was on the front page of the paper, and he said this is unique, and he added things that are kind of part of what I just said. He said, we have a situation in this country in which there's a political party that is not supportive of democracy. And he said, we have the first, more than any time in our history, a non-majoritarian government pressures to end the fact of majority party. And that's a sub-part of what I've described. But the fact is this issue is not just a United States issue, it is a global issue. And the issues I've just described to you are subtexts, are core components in this country, terribly important, that indicate a depth of a crisis that is broader. We can just look around the world, from Orban in Hungary to Bolsonaro in Brazil, to developments across the world of an increase, as Leonhardt's article indicated yesterday, of an increase in authoritarian autocracy. And what I've written about in a number of places describes what I think are the four primary underlying sources of this problem: increasing economic, political, social, educational, and health inequalities, increasing racism, anti-Semitism, and xenophobia, increasing tax, democracy itself, which again I just discussed, and something else I think is very important: the declining trust in nearly all major institutions. And what I'm going to argue is part of the reason for that is higher education's failure to do what it needs to do, and actually has done it other times in its history. And that gives a lot of weight indeed, to the role of higher education. And I think that higher education, following the work of the former president of Harvard, who built on the work of a great sociologist, Daniel Bell, but President Derek Bach, former president of Harvard, said universities are the most influential institution in advanced societies. More influential than the largest corporations, more influential than any other governmental institutions. And he built again on Daniel Bell, who was a great sociologist, and built on the work of other thinkers who talked about this work. Now, why is that for universities? The first idea is we are a developer of new ideas, new technologies, new discoveries. We actually represent a cutting edge of innovation and creativity. We are also not just involved in that, quote, area in space, but that we are the engines of local economic and national and global economies. On the issue of our role in economies, it isn't just new ideas and helping to develop areas of science and so on, but we function very much as institutions that are central to our communities. I have no doubt that University of Scranton plays a profound role in the economic work and development of the city of Scranton. A profound role. Universities tend to often be the largest employers, largest purchasers, largest landholders next to the church in almost every city in the United States. They actually serve to have something else that makes them very, very significant. And that is they serve, as Sandra indicated, as anchor institutions. Anchor institutions is rooted institutions that aren't going to move, that are key to the local environment. And universities play a profoundly powerful role. But of all the things it does, all the things universities do, more important is its role actually as an educational institution. Now, how can I say that? Look how powerful these roles are. But more than anything, I would argue, it is because of what we do educationally. And I'll talk about those two functions, but I want to focus on one here. We teach the teachers and the teachers' teachers. In 1902, I believe, William Rainey Hoffa, the president of University of Chicago, made a speech at University of California in which he said, universities, in spite of themselves, shape the schooling system. They teach the teachers and the teachers' teachers. Every field you can think of. Universities taught the people who do those fields. Engineering, law, medicine, science, and particularly teachers. Universities shape in a fundamental way the values, development, thinking of young people, and as they get older, as adults. They, in fact, if one would see what John Dewey wrote about, which he said, schooling system is more important than any other system, not the economic system, not the schooling system. And the argument there is no democratic universities, because we shape the schooling system, no democratic schooling, you will not have a fully democratic society. Tremendous influence, tremendous impact. And then this relates, though, what I would see, and when I emphasize that issue of education and teaching, connected to the two great missions of universities. I'm quoting two people who had roles at the University of Pennsylvania. That is the first one, and I think primary, is education for democratic citizenship. When Franklin founded Penn, and I'll talk about this a bit more because as Sandra indicated, I'm a historian. I teach in the history department, a number of other departments, but primarily in history. And as a historian, I've studied Franklin. I've written about Franklin. And when he founded Penn in 1749, he actually wrote proposals for educating the youth of Pennsylvania. And he said the purpose of an education, of higher education, was to develop in young people an inclination, moral joinment, and ability, intellectual, to serve human beings, one's country, friend, and family. And the inclination and ability to serve should be the great aim and end of all learning. That's a question of education for citizenship, and I will talk more about that. And then the other component is knowledge to advance the human condition, for the continuous betterment of the human condition. And that we can quote W.E.B. Du Bois, who was at Penn in the late 19th century, and said that his book he was writing and scholarship should serve as a scientific basis of further study and for practical reform, ideas to improve the world. And if we look now at the history of universities and we think about it, and someone asked me, I think Maury said to me, do universities ever do the things that they need to do now? They did. They didn't do it as well as they could, but in many ways, it's part of their history and tradition. If we look at colonial colleges, every colonial college except the University of Pennsylvania was founded for service for a religious purpose. Every single one. Harvard was Congregationalist. William and Mary was Anglican. Yale was Congregationalist. Princeton was Presbyterian. I could go through the list. Columbia, which was King's College, actually was Anglican at the time. Everyone to develop religiously orthodox men at the time who would serve as leaders of Christian commonwealths. For what purpose? Primarily for service. Somewhat economic, but primarily for service, except for Franklin, who created a secular institution and said it didn't matter, it wasn't to create a Christian commonwealth or any kind of commonwealth based on religion, but for citizenship overall. And if you look at religious affiliated colleges, in which we are in one, clearly they have service mission as central. If you think of the St. Ignatius, his whole idea, if I remember correctly, was focusing on urban areas, on improving the life of people in cities. I am sure that University of Scranton emphasizes social justice. I have no doubt. I don't have to read it. We'll talk about formation and development of young people, and in fact, being productive, and it will talk about social justice. Very importantly, of course, is the land-grant institutions. The land-grant institutions founded by the Morrill Act of 1862, signed by President Lincoln, talked about precisely advancing democracy and expanding the United States, providing adult education, educating people for service, and it was an innovation of world significance. The idea that education, formerly for elites, Franklin's idea, but would be for everyone. And certainly the second Morrill Act, or the second Morrill Act, which created historically black universities, colleges and universities, private ones preceded that with a very similar mission. And I'm going to go to urban research universities last, but chronologically they would follow where they're listed. But certainly community colleges and regional universities were developed to bring new populations, local populations in to be educated, to be contributing citizens for both economic and indeed for reasons of contributing to the overall society. Now, urban research universities, I'm highlighting in research universities for two reasons. One, I teach at one, and have been at one my whole career, but also because they have an influence over the entire system. Urban research universities, when they were created at Johns Hopkins. Johns Hopkins was created in 1876, if I recall, and when it was founded, the president of Hopkins, Daniel Coy Gilman, said the purposes of Hopkins and urban universities was to end misery among the poor, to improve honesty in business, to create better schools. Think about that. To in fact help to end poverty. Hopkins hasn't done that in Baltimore. Penn has not done that in West Philadelphia. But he is the founder of the first research universities, and then the other ones followed along a similar line. Columbia University, when they were developing as an institution, it was very clear that their issue was going to focus on connecting to the city, being core and part of the city of New York. And it would become clear that urban research universities would benefit academically if they focused on improving the quality of life in their city. Most famously, in some ways, University of Chicago, where actually a very religious Baptist leader, William Rainey Harper, said the university should be the messiah of democracy, and placed his university in urban area to reach out to its community. This was central and similar to the University of Pennsylvania and the Du Bois quote I gave you, a very important part. So all forms of these universities, all of them focused on colleges, focused on these core ideas, But the issue that happened is this stopped. Began to change. It began to change probably around World War I. There had been tremendous optimism. Knowledge could change the world. Knowledge could change the world. It was the idea of Francis Bacon. Knowledge is power, the great philosopher of the 16th century. Knowledge is power, in 17th century, early 17th century. Knowledge is power for the relief of man's estate. Not knowledge for its own sake. Knowledge is power to improve the world. That was the mission, certainly, of these research universities. There's no question in these other institutions, but the horror, the devastation of World War I, the war to end all wars and the slaughter that resulted crashed the optimism, led to a period of tremendous pessimism, that knowledge was no longer seen as a way to create a better world, but in fact could contribute to the destruction of human life. And there was a turn from engagement away to what I would call a scientism, not real science, to imitate engineering and physics the belief that we just observe, we watch phenomenon and we understand it, not to understand it to change things. So that dissolution had an amazingly powerful effect, and that began to change at the end of the Cold War. Began to change in the early 90s when, with the end of the Cold War, when actually members of Congress and Senate were saying to universities, and I remember it had to do with a committee that funded NSF, where I've done a lot of work and chaired various committees. One of the congressmen, I think it was George Brown from California, Democratic congressman, said to presidents of universities, what are you doing about poverty? What are you doing about problematic issues with healthcare? What are you doing about schooling? And suddenly, there was also a generation developing, many of the 60s generation, into leadership roles, who'd been students in the 60s. And there also began to be a literature that showed that academic work could make greater advances to knowledge often if it followed the idea of scholarship as engagement. Doing what the great social psychologist Kurt Lewin wrote, that if you really want to understand something, just try to change it. That Dewey was right and Plato was wrong. The two greatest philosophers on education were Plato and Dewey. John Dewey, arguably the greatest intellectual in the history of the United States, the most influential one. I see colleagues shaking their heads in agreement. No one had the influence Dewey had. No one. And I studied Dewey and I criticized him in my writing. But he and Plato both said education was the key to a better society. Not what Adam Smith and Marx said it's economics. No, they said it's education. And in that work, Plato said you learn by abstract contemplation because he believed in an elitist, non-democratic society. But education was central. Dewey said, I love you, Plato. That's the philosophy he read all the time. But he said, no, we're in a democracy. It's education by learning through engagement and reflection. That's very different. Not abstract contemplation, not philosopher kings. Engagement, and think about it, reflect, move forward. Engagement and reflection. Why? Because that's how you develop a democracy. That's how you develop it. So those ideas became more pertinent, and they began to develop. I want to make this clear, because I'm going to be very critical of universities not carrying that far enough. They began to develop what might be called something like an engaged approach and more community engagement at universities. And that would be, I say again, the turn of the 1990s with the end of the Cold War. Now, there are three types of universities, approaches to universities, I would argue. And what I'm going to call for is the need now for a democratic civic university. Let's a little bit of background, and I'm going to go out of order. So right now, one of the most powerful developments in universities are neoliberal universities, or entrepreneurial universities. Knowledge for what? Exclusively for economic gain. And I want to make that clear. I am not opposed to knowledge to help get people careers and have economic improvement, but exclusively. Entrepreneurial universities are in fact involved in the commercialization and the commodification of higher education, in which the purposes of knowledge are primarily economic, and there is an approach that in fact diminishes the role of the state and diminishes the role of service and sees the university's primary role as economic engines, no value, economic engines in which we educate our students not with idealism, but universities themselves behave as corporate entities primarily, A, and B, we emphasize the economic emphasis of universities and feel we don't have a role in the value formation of young people. Rather than seeing economic gain as one component, an important one, but not the primary one. And what this does, in my judgment, is academics as superstars. It's, in fact, the issue of students as customers and not as contributors. And it's educational institution as just another, I'm quoting from a former president of Penn, Sheldon Hackney, as another snout in the trough. Same as, and Derek Bach wrote about that. He said, this is the commercialization of higher education. Now, certainly there's a tradition of liberal arts education, which has certain strengths, but in the modern world, it creates real problems. And among those problems is in part the issue that it fails to come to grips with the elitist and elite traditions of liberal arts education. They haven't been inclusive. It hasn't engaged other forms of academic ideas. Now, I'm not a relativist. I believe actually there's a certain closer ways of understanding the world and moving things to produce change. However, there was an exclusivity and a separation. It was knowledge for its own sake, not knowledge to make things better. Jane Addams, the great peace activist, the great feminist activist, in 1899 made a speech and she said, universities and colleges, when they were founded, they were religious institutions. But you know what? They didn't judge themselves by how holy they were. They judged themselves by how many people they turned to God. And when they became secular institutions, they should have focused on relieving human suffering. Instead, they focused on knowledge for its own sake, traditional liberal arts, knowledge for its own sake, a means, knowledge, became an end, and they lost their way. Just think of that. A means, knowledge, becomes an end in itself, not a means for something, and they lost their way. Addams was brilliant. She also shaped Dewey 1,000 different ways, but that's a whole different lecture. So then the issue is, would a democratic civic university do? And I'm going to discuss that in a minute. But that is what I call for. I've been calling for in my writing, leading global and national coalitions. And I'm going to say it very clearly, I think, here. In my judgment, I'm not saying anyone else's, its primary mission should be advancing democracy democratically on campus, in the community, and across the wider society. The democratic mission should be the primary mission of higher education. Advancing democracy democratically means it's done democratically, not by autocratic or authoritarian means. That means people, students, faculty, staff, community members are involved in advancing democracy in a democratic way, an inclusive way, on campus and the wider society. Now, how do you create a democratic civic university? Let me start by saying, I don't know. Let me just tell you the truth. I don't know. I also can tell you I've been working in this area since, so such a long time, it's upsetting that I don't know. I literally have been focusing on the work probably continuously in this area since I ran into, a little before I ran into Sandra in the mid-1980s. I shouldn't walk. I'm sorry. You're missing. So I apologize. I apologize. I will stay here. In front of. I apologize. I apologize. Okay. And I apologize for those on live stream. I will stay put. Okay. So let me talk about things I think are needed. One is community partnerships. And I'll talk about that. The idea of partnering together. The idea that the campus itself is inclusive, diverse, equitable in terms of its nature and who's involved, and open. The university focuses on universal problems, which I'll talk a bit more about: poverty, poor education, inadequate health care, substandard housing, as they're manifested locally. These are not local problems. These are universal problems, but as they appear in the environment. The institution seriously focuses on issues of anti-racism and issues of justice. And it engages, and I'm going to get to a community of experts, which means that people learn not by just what the university knows, but the expertise that's found in the community is included. A community of experts acknowledges that people bring different skills, and for our hardest problems, they can't be solved by just the university alone. It requires people from different perspectives, citizens from outside campus, being partners in solving the problem. Impossible to solve the problems of poor schooling without engaging school students and teachers. It's impossible to solve the problems related to healthcare unless you involve the people as well in the communities who are affected that way. And importantly, it involves something that I call the 3 democratic Ps, democracy at its heart. That this type of work and these type of partnerships involve partnerships that have a democratic purpose. That is, the highest purpose is democracy, and that's what we work for. Not to engage in jargon, but I will. It's what Muzaffar Sharif wrote about, the great psychologist, a superordinate goal. That's our highest goal, and we all work for that. Democratic process, which means it's open. It means that we hear the voice of the community. Things are open. There's open learning. And it means fundamentally that we treat people with whom we work as ends in themselves and not as means to an end. What does that mean? It means when universities often get grants, they work with communities only as long as they have the grant. Community members are means to an end. They need to be ends in themselves. They are our neighbors. The people in the community are our neighbors. We work with them. Remember that song way back in the 60s, where it was by the Shirelles, "Will You Love Me Tomorrow?" When universities ask that question, they usually say, "I'll love you as long as I have a grant." The real question is, we're with this together. This ain't no date, this is a marriage. We keep working together. And finally, democratic product, and what does that mean? That means the transformation is mutual. This is not Mother Teresa. I'm not against Mother Teresa. She was brilliant and great and did great things. However, this is not just helping those, it's helping all of us. It means there's a transformation of universities as well as a transformation of the community. It's very important. There's a mutuality of benefit and a mutuality of change. Now, I'm not going to go in detail about the Netter Center because I want to just touch on it and to give background of how to do this. Remember I said I don't really know how to do it? That's true. I've been working at this again since the mid-'80s, but the center I direct attempts to get at this problem. And we do this through 3 emphases. The first is academically based community service, and this is now something that other universities have done. It's like a service learning approach where you learn from service with the community, but there's something different about this. These are credit-bearing courses that, in fact, seek to solve problems in the community. Credit-bearing from graduate and undergraduate courses. So we had a great sociolinguist at Penn named Bill Labov. Bill Labov is one of the greatest scholars in sociology. He and Noam Chomsky were the great scholars of sociolinguistics. And Bill Labov turned his work to work in the West Philadelphia community, in which he used local culture and history and hip-hop rhythms to teach standard English that had an extraordinary impact, that then spread across the country. And Labov's work that he did created a Penn Reading Initiative in which students work in this way, writing stories, doing artwork, working with the young people in the community to exhibit and present what they've learned in reading. It transformed Labov's work. There's someone inside, I can go on, but I'll give just one other case. We do this in the humanities, in a program we have of using August Wilson plays, a professor of English, and then does theater productions with school children and West Philadelphia residents at a house, the Paul Robeson House in West Philadelphia, in which he, in fact, does those stories for West Philadelphia. And finally, I'll just tell you, a professor in neurobiology, Laurie Flanagan Cato, has young people learn neurobiology by them teaching it to a high school that never would have had any neurobiology. and the Penn students increase and improve their work. Lori claims it's improved her work. And we just got a report from the head of science at Robeson High School, who said that in the science area, the increase across the board, still as a school, it has a lot of ways to go, was among the highest of all the high schools in the city, if not the highest. And its biology scores were extraordinarily strong, and he credits Lori Flanagan's course to do that. We have about 78 courses a year, or 80 courses a year, with about 1,800 students doing this work. Another approach we have is university assists and about 40 departments in 11 of Penn's 12 schools. University-assisted community schools. I talked about Dewey. Dewey created the idea of community schools. Community schools were developed as he learned it from Jane Addams at Hull House and Lillian Wald in New York, Henry Street Settlement, mostly from Jane Addams. They said schools were everywhere, settlements were scattered. We want to bring services to people. And Dewey took that idea and said, in 1902, let's create community schools, which are very hot now in the United States. California is providing $3 billion to community schools, and President Biden has just pushed for about $500 million for community schools. And I said schools should be hubs of neighborhood, centers for the whole community. What Dewey never did was connect his work on learning by doing and reflecting to the community school idea. So his idea of community schools was just centers of neighborhoods that reach out, reach in, become neighborhood hubs. And work that I've done in community school area, we brought those two ideas together to say young people will learn best when they are at a community school, when they work to solve the problems of the neighborhood. So schools as centers for democracy, that was Dewey's idea, centers of face-to-face community. And at the same time as he emphasized that, he said, separately, you should learn by doing and reflecting, and we brought that together in terms of problem solving. But there's something else. How do you sustain a community school? Where does it get the resources to have extended day programs, adult programs? Where does it get the resources to provide services? Where does it get the resources to create creative, intellectual work for particularly poor communities that do not have that? Where they get that and where they will get that, we argue, is universities. That universities should be hubs of themselves, but bring the resources to the school so that universities are the core partners. So what does that mean in our work? That means of those 1,800 students in academic courses, we bring an additional 1,200 volunteers and work-study students working in West Philadelphia schools. 4,000 or so Penn undergraduates and graduate students and faculty doing work together, working with about 4,000 students and their families at 8 university-assisted community schools, which argues, in effect, you cannot solve the problem of schooling by focusing on education, or economics by focusing on just economics, or health by focusing on health. You have to bring it together in place where people live, where they're located, where they live their lives. Otherwise, you have fragmentation, and you don't bring it together to produce real change. And we see the school as the hub. And then the other part, we see this as part of a larger project that Sandra mentioned, the idea that universities should be democratic anchor institutions. That means do this work academically, but also bring in the economic and corporate components of the institution. So that you create job training programs for young people. You have jobs for young people. You hire local vendors. You provide an opportunity to help create housing that's multi-class and diverse. The university serves as a catalyst and a partner, utilizing its economic resources for the same democratic ends as academically based community service and university-assisted community schools. So the question is, where do we go from here? That's always the hard question. I always tell my students, there are 3 questions in the research we do. Well, really 4. What's the current condition? That's an empirical question. What is the current condition? Next question is, what would you like to see happen? What would you like to see? What would it look like? What would you like to see change? And you have to explain the third question, why does the current condition exist? Why? So why does it exist, and what would you like to see change, right? Those are all good questions. They're relatively easy. They're relatively easy. Because people write this stuff all the time. I've done it myself. This must change. This should change. This has to change. How do you turn must into action? How do you turn should turn into action? How do you turn it has to change into action? How do you say things like, it's the public will? How do you change the public will? That's the question. I tell my students, if you send me a paper, because I do this myself and I try to stop doing it, it's full of mustisms and shouldisms. I tell them you should have taken a different class. You chose the wrong class. It isn't good for you. You're not going to do well. The hardest question is how to. And the pragmatists in Dewey never answered that question. They had an approach, but they didn't talk about how do you get from here to there. That's why Lewin is so brilliant, right? If you really want to change something, just try to change it. So here's the steps I would take. One thing you have to do, which is still relatively easy, which I do all the time, is call for searching critiques. Universities have to look at themselves. They have to look at themselves and search and critique. Look at the state of the world. I'm going to talk about my own institution. Even though I'm being taped, I'm going to say this. Penn's a great institution. It has done extraordinary work. Look what it's done in mRNA. Look what it's done now, and it's extraordinary. Look at the conditions of West Philadelphia. Penn is not living up to Franklin's promise. I'm going to say that right now. It's not living up to Franklin's promise. A searching critique would be, you're not doing what you say. And then there's a question of looking at how this is hypocrisy somewhat. You claim these things, but you're not doing them, right? You claim these things, and you're not doing it. Hypocrisy is the homage that vice pays to virtue. The homage that vice pays to virtue. It means that you look and say, you're saying, you know you should do that, but you're not doing it. And the great social change leaders, from Martin Luther King to the suffragettes, they always did that. Always, search and critique. Then I argue what I've been arguing. Focus on place, on community. Focus on the idea of academically based community service courses do too. Focus on the local geographic community, the idea that these are universal problems. Programs to improve reading in West Philadelphia is in fact similar to focusing on problems of reading in Detroit, Cleveland, New York, Scranton, Mexico City, Johannesburg. You can keep going. These are universal problems. Poor, inadequate health care, universal problems. Tremendous social inequality. Look at the inequality scale mushrooming, unfortunately worse relatively in the United States, but all over the world. In local communities, they're universal problems. And one reason we don't solve them, these problems, is because we don't do the intense learning with community, which I've talked about. Third, from now on we function on the Noah principle. You know Noah in the Bible. Noah in the Bible. What was Noah's statement in the Bible? The idea is no more prizes for predicting rain, prizes only for building the arks. No prizes just because you say something we're predicting, oh, this is terrible. Oh, that's going to happen if we don't do something. Prizes for universities for building the arks, for doing, not for talking. You can talk, but then do. You can do, then talk, but you got to do. Noah principle. And third, or fourth rather, what I've argued for, a locally rooted global movement. That for this to change, then does indeed need to be a focus on how this local work can connect to a global movement. And now I'm going to talk about one more thing, and then we'll have time to chat together. Sandra and I and others have been involved in developing organizations to spread and develop this work. And there are a whole series of organizations that I've been part of, and I'll mention them, but I want to focus on this. Under the Casey administration, thanks in part to the goading of then Governor Casey, he urged us to form a coalition in the city region of Philadelphia, partly because universities weren't cooperating enough. And he didn't like that. And he said, Ira, if I'm going to keep supporting your work and let you hang around with Sandra, if I'm going to do that, I'll let you hang with Sandra only if you help build the coalition. And we called it the Philadelphia Higher Education Network for Neighborhood Development. And we now have 26 universities in Philadelphia focusing on this kind of work. started under Governor Casey. Then, in fact, there's another organization that was formed that Sandra's gone to many of these meetings, the Anchor Institutions Task Force. I was asked to do a report for Secretary Donovan, when he was Secretary of HUD, and that report led to an organization called the Anchor Institutions Task Force that engages university leadership, leadership of medical institutions, leadership of arts organizations, of hospitals, of libraries, of a range of organizations and community groups working to create democratic partnerships focusing on democratic anchor institutions, issues of social justice, equity, democracy, democratic partnerships, local work together and mutual benefit. And the idea is working to create this in the United States and throughout the world. And Europe has just set up a similar organization. And also there's a group that we have that we work with and created to replicate or adapt our university-assisted community schools. Every third year, we choose another university to, in fact, advance this work throughout the United States. And recently it was UCLA and University of Binghamton that does this. We have 70 universities that are part of a national network. But the thing I want to conclude on is this global movement. Since 1999, we've been working with the Council of Europe, 49 European countries, and a group that I chair called the International Consortium for Higher Education, Civic Responsibility, and Democracy. And that organization includes the United States higher education groups, South Africa, the United Kingdom, and Ireland and Australia. And we've been working together in creating a partnership in global forums pushing this work. 6 global forums, 6 books, but something happened recently. They recognized that democratic crisis. And recently, the Organization of American States joined. That's 35 countries in Latin America and the United States and Caribbean and North America, Canada also. And the International Association of Universities, which is 120 countries are members. And why did they suddenly get interested? That democratic crisis. There's deep reason to worry all over the world about this. Deep reason. And we formed a new organization called the Global Cooperation for the Democratic Mission of Higher Education. I apologize for not, well, it is on the slide. Democratic Cooperation for the Democratic Mission of Higher Education. And we just had a meeting in Dublin in June 15th and 16th. And at that meeting, 40 countries were represented, urging that the primary mission of universities should be the democratic mission, to advance democracy democratically on campus, in the community, in the wider society. Doesn't mean it will get done, but these works are not parochial. This is not a local crisis only. It is a local crisis. It is not just a regional crisis. It is a regional crisis, but not only. It is not just a national crisis, and unfortunately, it is a major national crisis. It is also a crisis across the world. And I think the question here is to, in fact, do what, again, John Dewey recommended. John Dewey wrote that democracy must begin at home, meaning locally, and its home is a neighborly community. And what I'm arguing for, given the university's central role, economically, culturally, but its central role in education, its central role in advancing knowledge, its central role as a local, national, and global institution. And I've changed Dewey's statement. Democracy must begin at home, and home is the neighborly, democratic civic university and its local community partners. That's what we must work on together in this city, at this university, and every city and university in the United States and throughout the world. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll take questions. Thank you. And please tell me who you are.
My name is Jerry Tracy. I'm a graduate of this place. Thank you very much. Not just good. I also am a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania.
Me too.
And I was looking at your logo. When I was there was no community involvement visible. The only community involvement was trying to get through the community with a flak vest and not get shot.
Right.
So this is magnificent for me as a graduate. Number two, it was started here 2004, medical school, and we relied on John Dewey.
Really?
Practically everything we came up with came from his philosophy. And I'm going to brag. We're not supposed to brag in Lackawanna County. Everything's better in another county. But I could tell you they've done very, very, very well applying the same principles that you just said. And I think you might even be interested to seeing the outreach and the number of people and institutions that have been favorably affected by this type of outreach.
Great.
But this was a great talk.
Thank you very much. And I'm very interested in learning from what's going on here at the university. Yes. Yes.
My name is David Falk. I'm Penn 72. I'm having a hard time formulating the question, but my worry is that are we too late? We're seeing the authoritarian, even neo-fascism, that's being featured. The former president had a college background, half Catholic at Fordham, half at Penn, at Wharton. His promoters, like Kellyanne Conway and Steve Bannon, went to Catholic schools, and Bannon also went to an Ivy League school. His enablers are many Ivy League graduates: Ted Cruz, Tom Cotton, Ron DeSantis, J.D. Vance, Ben Sass. We see all of this.
Mnuchin was at Yale, as I remember. Yeah.
And I guess I'm wondering if there's just no way that the SATs measure character.
Right.
And where that may fit in. And my second worry, because you talked about the entrepreneurial schools. Unfortunately, this university once featured an article about a young entrepreneur who now hosts a platform that is the site of all sorts of anti-Semitic and Christian nationalism, and was the place where the shooter at Pittsburgh live stream, Gab, comes from this community. And I'm wondering, do you go in? Should you be going into the Wharton School and telling them it's more than just what you're doing? And what about the pushback from places like the Chicago School of Economics and George Mason University?
Yes, absolutely.
How do you overcome those things?
Well, that is a superb question, and I'll give the same answer I gave earlier. I really don't know how to overcome it. I can tell you what we've tried to do. So let me get in, and I'll get to the question about too late. In one level, it does engage a searching critique to criticize those approaches. And I've written, and other colleagues have, and organized these kind of coalitions to make clear the limits and failures of those other approaches. So one thing it is to state directly, I'm talking about dealing with questions of George Mason, first to start with that, and to indicate how the funds from the Koch brothers in Florida and at George Mason have had devastating impacts on intellectual development and work, and to raise up what universities are about on that. So that's at one level. On the level of our failure, the fact that from the University of Pennsylvania cometh Donald Trump. Right? That failure. I can give other individuals who've been, as you said, enablers from there and other institutions. The question is, again, to hold up, because it's always been an issue of presenting what the alternative and pointing, in fact, to what should have and could have been done. And the fact that that existed and people come out of these schools are signs of the failure, hypocrisy. Holding up what do you really stand for? So it is that kind of searching critique. On the question of the really profoundly hard question of, let me say one other thing is, it's also to show facts on the ground that this work is more productive of intellectual and civic development of young people and produces powerful results in scholarship. So one thing that you need to do is do the work and show that it is a powerful alternative and build coalitions that other people do it to say, we can show the work. But then the question of too late, I would put it in the other way, this way, that we were in a situation of incredible crisis. Not just, crisis means acute, but we could say we've had a chronic crisis. Now it's a super acute crisis. Well, nature of our society, the nature of our founding principles, the nature of how we treat each other is in jeopardy. So the question is, it's not that it's too late, it's just more important than ever to step up and make the case. That crises demand increased action. And that in fact, rather than passivity or saying, now is the time to point out what the differences are. And one can never tell how things will reshape and how certain directions can change. There have been hopeful signs in the United States in terms of electoral politics. There have been mixed signs in Europe, back and forth in different ways. But the idea is that you don't know where things will shape. And the question of getting universities engaged has always been crucial. But now I would argue it's more important than ever. We can't be spectators. We have to be engaged. And it just makes the demand for action more stronger and the need for universities to do something differently more and more important. So that would be my answer. Yes, anybody else?
Maury Myers. I have a couple of questions, Ira. First is community colleges and vocational training programs. If Dewey said it begins at home, why isn't more attention given in both the educational process and the infusion of democratic principles at those levels? And the second question is...
So let me see, which levels? At the community level, at the school level, at the local level?
Community college and vocational training programs.
Right.
Why aren't you doing something? Why isn't University of Pennsylvania saying we have a great concern not only with our fine institution, but with infusing in these other...
That's very important, yes, absolutely.
And the second question is sticker price. How can the University of Pennsylvania and other elite institutions justify continued democratic process when you're talking about $70,000 a year?
I agree. So let me take the first question. It is crucial that universities both create an articulation with community colleges and training programs, but it's also that they become involved themselves. So at the Netter Center, we actually have programs in which we have young people now, when they graduate, just started this one, when they graduate high school, they have an immediate connection if they don't have a job yet, or they're not going on to secondary school, to begin to connect to the hospital of the University of Pennsylvania, and we try to work them to get jobs. We also have developed programs with community college, so people have choices, so in which we have members of the Penn community work with community college staff to work with high school students, to in fact get them into community college and work to in fact get their degrees. We've also have programs in which young people in the field of health take their entire high school curriculum related to various science subjects from 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, working with the neurology department, GI, cardiology, and with the vet school, and have a curriculum in which they actually learn job and academic skills by working at these settings. And I think universities need to do that and work with vocational training and community colleges, but also with their own resources to provide academic as well as job training activities and possibilities. So that I believe that completely. The other question you raised, couldn't agree more. There was a devastating critique in, I think I'm trying to think what journal it is, American Prospect, of how much money elite universities have and how much they cost. And there needs to, in fact, be that issue of emphasizing not only diversifying the educational opportunity, but need to not just do that on a racial basis, but on an economic basis. I believe at elite schools, there are more students from the top 1% than the bottom 60. Just think about that. Elite schools in the United States, including my own, there are more students in the top 1% than the bottom 60. What that requires is the kind of radical change I'm speaking about, the kind of searching critique and raising that question. Because if it doesn't happen, on the universities doing it on their own, I assure you, both political parties increasingly will be focusing on that and make dramatic changes in how these universities function, not all to the good. So this is a crucial issue. They need to change the who goes, how much it costs, and the whole balance on issues of diversity, cost, and inclusion of students from lower socioeconomic levels. Now, Penn and other schools have done a lot in 5 years, but it's illusory, it's incremental. And they need to do this not incrementally, but on a large scale. So I agree completely. Yes?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I would like to add to what you've said, the word citizen.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Americans have to know that they're citizens, not just consumers or bystanders. And I think that part of the education process has to include that. The other, about the cost of Penn, is the cost of every academic institution in the United States of America. I mean, it's different in other places.
Right.
It's paid for. And I think that's one of our big mistakes.
Right. One thing I wanted to say also on the cost issue that's important to understand is, it relates to Sandra's points, the escalation of course has been dramatic. And even though universities provide more money for scholarship, it doesn't solve the dilemma. The question really is, in part, the cutting of the cost is one, but fundamentally, it's providing educational opportunity for all at all kinds of institutions. At all kinds of institutions. And in terms of Penn, that's what Franklin did. You know, he was up in Boston. He left Boston because it was too elitist, and the Harvard was too elitist for him. He came south to our Commonwealth, to the city of Philadelphia, to create a different kind of institution, open to all, unfortunately, it was just men, young men of talent. That's a very different position. So particularly, I believe all elite schools should do this, but Penn, if it wants to realize Franklin's vision, it has to make the school available for all young people of talent and to provide opportunities of people across all economic levels where in fact, the bottom 60% represents 60% of the Penn student body. That's what needs to happen. So I couldn't agree more. Any further questions, critiques, disagreements, agreements? Well, and if not, I want to thank all of you for your time, for your effort. I apologize for the people who saw me roaming. I was focusing on my colleagues in this room. But again, thank you for your time, and thanks very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.